CEO closed his repair shop. Then the single dad opened a factory that swallowed her market. The letter arrived on a Monday. It was 3 paragraphs long, printed on Vantex industrial letterhead, signed by a woman named Claire Sutton, Chief Executive Officer, and it informed Caleb Dre, in language that was precise in the way that legal language is precise, when it has been designed to leave no room for appeal, that his lease on Unit 14 at the Kellner Industrial Park would not be renewed. That pursuant to Vantex's ongoing redevelopment of the Kellner campus, all existing tenant agreements in Block C were being terminated with 60 days written notice, effective the date of the letter. That Vantex appreciated his tenancy and wished him well in his future endeavors. 3 paragraphs, 14 years. Dre Precision Repair had been in Unit 14 for 14 years. It had started as a one-man shop, Seth Dre, 31, a set of tools he'd bought at an estate sale, and a reputation built slowly from word of mouth across the county's manufacturing corridor. In 14 years, it had grown to 8 employees, a client list that included 7 mid-size industrial manufacturers, and a specialization in the repair and recalibration of precision CNC machinery that had made Dre Precision the first call. Not the backup call, the first call for a 100-mile radius when a machine tool went down and a production line stopped. It had also, in that time, acquired one more thing: a 5-year-old girl named Lily, who attended morning kindergarten at Waverly Elementary and came to the shop every afternoon, where she sat at the corner desk that Seth had built to her height and did her worksheets and drew pictures and held, with a dedication that bordered on professional, a stuffed rabbit named Button, who had been with her since the hospital, and who had by now accumulated enough mileage to qualify for several frequent flyer tiers. The letter went on the workbench. Seth read it twice. He put it down. He picked up the machine he had been recalibrating. A spindle head from a 5-axis milling center, brought in by a client who had a production run starting Thursday. And he continued the work. He did not call anyone that day. He did not post anything. He finished the spindle, ran its calibration cycle, packaged it for pickup, and at 3:15 drove to Waverly Elementary. In the truck on the way home, Lily said, "You're quiet today, Dad," he said. "I'm thinking." She said, "What about?" He said, "Where things go next." She held Button against her chest. Button, whose left ear had developed a slight leftward tilt from years of being held in exactly that position, and she said, "Do things always have to go somewhere?" He said, "Good things do." She thought about this. Then she said, "Button went to the hospital, and then he went to me." Seth said, "That's right." She said, "So maybe where things go next is always better than where they were." He drove. He looked at the road. He said, "Maybe so." He meant it. Stay with this one. The ending is worth every minute. The Kellner Industrial Park sat at the edge of Dre County's manufacturing corridor. 22 units across 4 blocks, built in the 1980s, occupied for decades by the specific kind of small to mid-industrial operation that forms the working skeleton of a regional economy without ever appearing in anyone's press release. Machine shops, fabricators, a plastics processor, a company that made specialty gaskets for the agricultural sector, and in Unit 14, Block C, Dre Precision Repair. Claire Sutton had taken over Vantex Industrial Group 14 months before the letter. She was 34. She had been brought in by Vantex's board to modernize the company's asset portfolio, a phrase that, translated from the language of corporate restructuring, meant identifying underutilized real estate and converting it to higher yield use. The Kellner campus, under Claire Sutton's assessment, was underutilized. Block C in particular was occupied by legacy tenants on below-market leases who were, in the board's view, impeding the site's redevelopment potential. The plan was to clear Block C, raise the units, and develop a logistics and warehousing hub that would lease to a regional distribution company. at 3 times the per square foot rate currently collected from existing tenants. It was, on paper, a sensible plan. The person who had designed the plan, who had identified the Kellner opportunity, structured the development proposal, and presented it to the board with the particular confidence of a man who treats other people's livelihoods as line items, was Vantex's head of portfolio strategy. His name was Dominic Hale, 48 years old. Suits that cost more than some of Seth Dre's monthly equipment leases. A watch that Seth noticed on the one occasion he had encountered Hale at the Kellner management office. A watch that sat on the wrist with the quiet authority of something that did not need to announce itself. Dominic Hale had written the Kellner development proposal. He had also, Seth would later learn, structured the proposal in a way that obscured a material fact from the board. A fact about the existing tenant base, specifically about what those tenants were worth to the regional industrial supply chain. Specifically about what would happen when they left. Dominic knew what would happen. He had the analysis. He had simply chosen not to include it in the version he presented. Seth did not know any of this on the Monday the letter arrived. He knew only that he had 60 days, 8 employees, and a precision repair business that needed a building. He finished the spindle. He picked up his daughter. He drove home. He made dinner. The first week after the letter, Seth told his employees. He held the conversation in the shop on a Tuesday morning before the first client arrived. He did not soften it. He said, "Vantex has terminated our lease. We have 60 days. My intention is to find a new space and continue operations without interruption. If that changes, you will hear it from me before you hear it from anyone else." His longest-serving employee, a man named Conrad, who had been with Dre Precision for 9 years, and whose hands were among the most capable Seth had ever seen applied to precision machinery, said, "What do you need from us?" Seth said. "Do the work, same as always. I'll handle the rest." He began making calls that afternoon. He worked the phones in the evenings, after Lily was in bed, with Button tucked beside her, and the hall light left on at the angle that she preferred. Not too bright, not too dark. The particular angle they had worked out together over the course of approximately 14 bedtime negotiations, that Seth remembered with more fondness than the number suggested, was reasonable. The calls produced discouraging results. Available industrial space in the county was limited. What was available was either too small. Dre Precision's 8 employees and equipment required a minimum of 6,000 square feet, or priced at rates that, given the disruption cost of a move, would require Seth to either lay off staff or take on debt at a level that made him uncomfortable. He was not someone who borrowed money against uncertainty. He was someone who had learned from his father and from 14 years of running a business on thin margins. That debt taken in crisis is debt that shapes decisions afterward. He did not want his decisions shaped that way. On the 9th evening after the letter, he drove to the Kellner site after hours and walked the perimeter of Block C alone, which was something he sometimes did when he needed to think in 3 dimensions. When the problem in his head needed to be in a physical space to become clear, he walked the loading bays. He looked at the footprint of the 4 units. He looked at the access road. He looked at the power infrastructure. He stood in the dark for a while. Then he got in the truck and drove home. In the kitchen, he opened his laptop and started making a different kind of call. There was a property 40 minutes east of the Kellner site. It had been a light manufacturing facility, closed for 6 years, its equipment removed by creditors, and its building sitting on 12 acres of level ground with loading dock access, 3-phase power, and a roof that a structural inspection, which Seth commissioned in the 2nd week and paid for himself, confirmed was in serviceable condition. The asking price for a long-term lease was within range. Not comfortably, It would require Seth to restructure his operating costs and potentially bring in a silent partner, but within range. The building was 41,000 square feet. Dre Precision Repair needed 6,000. Seth Dre stood in the middle of the empty floor of the facility on a Thursday afternoon with Conrad beside him and said, "What do you see?" Conrad looked around for a long time. He said, "I see a lot of empty floor." Seth said, "So do I." Conrad looked at him. He said, "What are you thinking?" Seth said, "I'm thinking we've been repairing precision machinery for 14 years. I'm thinking we know what every machine in the county sounds like when it's working, and what it sounds like when it isn't. I'm thinking we know the tolerances better than the manufacturer's reps who sell the machines new." Conrad waited. Seth said, "I'm thinking we could make them." The idea was not entirely new. It had lived in the back of Seth's mind for years as one of those things that a person holds at a distance, not because the idea is wrong, but because the conditions for it have not yet arranged themselves. He had the technical knowledge. He had the calibration expertise. He had 8 employees whose cumulative experience with precision tooling exceeded, by his estimate, 160 years. What he had not had was space, capital, or occasion. Vantex Industrial had, in 60 days' notice, provided him with 2 of the 3. The capital problem he solved across the following 2 weeks. Conrad put in. 2 of the other long-tenured employees asked to be included. Grady Marsh, a manufacturing supplier Seth had worked with for a decade, and who had been told about the plan over coffee at a diner table, and who had looked at the napkin Seth had been using to sketch the floor layout and said, quietly, that he had been waiting for something like this to exist. Grady committed a figure that changed the arithmetic significantly. And a banker named Eleanor Price, who had held Seth's business account for 11 years, and who said, when he presented his plan to her in a document that was thorough without being optimistic, that she had been watching Dre Precision for over a decade and knew what it was worth. Eleanor structured a facility that covered the gap. He signed the lease on a Friday. He called his employees from the parking lot of the building. He said, "We move in 3 weeks. We open for repair operations on schedule. We begin manufacturing development the month after." He said, "If you're in, I need to know now, because what comes next is going to ask something of you that the last 14 years didn't." All 8 said yes. He drove to pick up Lily. In the truck, she asked where he'd been. He said, "Looking at the new place." She said, "Is it good?" He said, "It's going to be." She said, "Does it have room for Button?" He said, "It has room for everything." She held Button a little closer and looked out the window at the afternoon going past and seemed, in the way that she often seemed, satisfied with information that an adult would have required more detail about. The move took 8 days. Not 60, 8. Seth had planned it the way he planned everything, with the kind of specificity that looks like overcaution until it produces a result, and then looks like genius. Every machine logged, every tool inventoried, every calibration record transferred. The new facility had been cleaned, the power verified, the loading docks inspected. Conrad had organized the floor layout from Seth's sketch with improvements that Seth incorporated immediately, because Conrad's spatial reasoning was, if Seth was being accurate about it, better than his own in 3 dimensions. They were operational in the new space on day 9. 3 of their 7 clients called in the first week to ask if there had been any disruption. Seth said, none. All 3 said they hadn't noticed anything. That was the answer he had been building toward. It was in the 4th week of operations at the new facility that the first piece of manufacturing equipment came off the floor. It was a recalibration jig, a tool used to reset the positional accuracy of CNC machine spindles after service. Not a glamorous product, a tool room tool. The kind of thing that exists invisibly inside manufacturing operations, used by technicians who need it without ceremony, and at a price point that the major equipment suppliers had, for structural reasons having to do with their own margins, never bothered to optimize. Seth had been making do with a commercial version for 14 years. He had adapted it, modified it, understood exactly what it did, and exactly where it fell short. The version he built in week 4 was, in the language of people who used such tools, significantly better. Conrad tested it. Then he tested it again. Then he handed it to the technician who had been with Dre Precision the longest, after Conrad, and asked him to use it without explanation. The technician used it. Then he said, "Where did this come from?" Seth said, "We made it." The technician looked at it. He said, "Can I keep it?" Seth said, "We'll make more." Word among precision manufacturing technicians travels differently than word among civilians. It travels in service calls and calibration logs and conversations held over equipment in dim factory corners. It travels through the particular community of people who work with machines at the level where the difference between 1,000th of an inch and 2,000ths of an inch is not abstract, where it is the difference between a part that is good and a part that is not. In that community, the Dre jig moved fast. 6 orders in the first 2 weeks, 11 in the third. By the end of the second month, Seth had redesigned his floor allocation to accommodate a dedicated manufacturing line for the jig and 2 subsequent products: a spindle testing rig and a calibration arm reference tool that had emerged from conversations with clients who had seen the jig and asked, in the direct way that people who work with machinery tend to ask things, whether he could make one of those but for this. He could make one of those but for this. He could usually make it better than the thing they were comparing it to, because he had spent 14 years understanding exactly what the thing needed to do. The revenue from manufacturing crossed the revenue from repair in month 4. Not because repair had declined, repair had grown, because the new space allowed them to take on larger equipment, and the reputation that had built quietly over 14 years was now building loudly, but because the manufacturing side was compounding in a way that Seth had projected, and that was nonetheless slightly faster than he had allowed himself to expect. He did not tell anyone. He wrote it in the small notebook he kept in his jacket pocket, in the column he reserved for things that were happening the way he had hoped. The column was not long. He was not someone who hoped publicly or counted on outcomes that hadn't occurred yet. But the entries were specific, and in the 4th month they were accumulating. The board called Claire Sutton in on a Tuesday in what had become month 5 of the Dre operation. Not about Dre, not specifically. But the board had commissioned an independent market assessment of the regional precision manufacturing and repair sector, because Vantex had a new acquisition target in that sector, and the board wanted to understand the landscape before committing capital. The assessment had a section on competitive infrastructure. In that section, there was a company that the analyst had flagged as a significant and recently emerged factor in the market. The company had not existed 18 months ago in any form the analyst could identify. It was now supplying 7 manufacturers in the corridor, had a repair operation with a documented response time that the analyst described as unusual for a business of its size, and had a product line, 3 tools, all in the precision calibration category, that had achieved a market penetration in 12 months that the analyst noted typically took established competitors 5 to 7 years. The analyst had also noted, almost as a footnote, that the company's founder had previously operated out of the Kellner Industrial Park. Unit 14, Block C. Claire Sutton read the report at her desk. She read the footnote. She set the report down. She asked her assistant to find the lease termination file for Kellner Block C. She read the file. She read the development proposal. She read the board presentation that Dominic Hale had prepared 14 months ago, the one that had persuaded the board to clear Block C. Then she pulled the internal analysis that Dominic Hale's team had produced before the presentation. The full analysis, not the excerpt that had been presented to the board. She read it for a long time. The full analysis contained a section that the presentation had not. A section that assessed the economic value of the existing Block C tenant base. Not just their lease revenue, but their function in the regional supply chain. Their contribution to the manufacturing corridor's resilience, the downstream impact of their removal. The analysis had modeled the scenario in which the tenants, unable to find comparable space in the county, relocated or closed. It had also modeled a second scenario, the scenario in which one or more of the displaced tenants, rather than closing, found a path to expansion. Dominic Hale had seen this analysis. He had written this analysis. He had presented a version of it to the board that omitted the second scenario entirely. Claire Sutton picked up her phone. She did not call Dominic Hale. She called Vantex's legal counsel. Seth was in the manufacturing floor on the morning Claire Sutton's office. Called. He was working a problem with the second-generation spindle tester. A calibration issue in the reference surface that he had identified the day before, in which he had come in at 6:30 to address before the day's other work began. The floor was quiet at that hour. Conrad was in, and one other technician. The light through the high windows was early morning light, flat and honest, the kind of light that shows you what things actually are. His phone went to voicemail. The caller left a message. "This is Renata Walsh, assistant to Claire Sutton at Vantex Industrial. Miss Sutton would like to arrange a meeting with you at your earliest convenience. Please call back at." He listened to it twice. He finished the calibration on the reference surface. He ran a test cycle. The numbers were correct. Then he called back. The meeting was at the Vantex offices. Seth came with Eleanor Price, who had agreed to attend on the basis that she had been involved in the financing and had a professional interest in understanding what was being proposed. Claire Sutton met them in the lobby. She was professionally composed. She did not perform warmth she did not have. She said, "Thank you for coming." She led them to a conference room. On the table was the market analysis report, and beside it, a second document that Seth recognized as the Kellner lease termination letter. She said, "I want to be direct with you," he said. "Please," she said. "The decision to terminate your lease was made on the basis of an internal analysis that I have since learned was materially incomplete. The version presented to the board omitted a scenario assessment that, had the board seen it, would likely have produced a different outcome." Eleanor Price said, "What scenario was omitted?" Claire said. "The scenario in which a displaced tenant expanded rather than closed," she said. The analysis modeled it. It was not included in the board presentation. I have spent the last week determining how that omission occurred and who was responsible for it. She put a third document on the table. Seth looked at it. It was an internal email chain, printed, 6 pages, dated across a period of 3 weeks before the board presentation. The emails were between members of Dominic Hale's team. They discussed the scenario assessment. One email, from Dominic Hale himself, said, with a directness that Seth found remarkable in its transparency about intent, "Remove the expansion scenario from the board deck. It complicates the narrative we need." Seth looked at this for a long moment. Claire said, "Dominic Hale is no longer with Vantex. That happened 10 days ago. I am telling you this now, in this meeting, because the action taken against your business was taken as a result of information that was deliberately distorted, and you deserve to know that," she said. "I cannot give you Unit 14 back. The development is proceeding. But I owe you a direct acknowledgement that what happened was wrong. Not wrong because you succeeded despite it, but wrong because it was based on a process that was dishonest." She said it looking at him. No deflection. "Not I'm sorry if this caused difficulty. Wrong," she said, "because it was based on a process that was dishonest. Seth was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What does Vantex want from this meeting?" she said. "We have a new acquisition target in the precision tooling sector. The board has asked me to identify the strongest independent operators in the regional corridor as part of our due diligence. Your company is the strongest I found," she said. "I want to know if you would be willing to discuss a partnership arrangement. Distribution of your products through Vantex's National Industrial Supply Network in exchange for capital access and logistics infrastructure that would allow you to scale." Eleanor Price was making notes. Seth looked at the email printout on the table. He looked at the Kellner termination letter. He said, "I need to ask you something first," she said. "Yes," he said, "the distribution arrangement. Does it give Vantex any claim on the manufacturing IP?" she said. "No. That was the first term I specified when I had legal draft this." "Your designs are yours," he said. "And the employees?" she said. "The arrangement covers operational expansion. I would expect your existing staff to benefit from scale, not be replaced by it." He looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at her notes and then at him, and gave him the particular expression that meant, "The numbers work your call." Seth said, "I'll need the draft agreement in writing. I'll need a week to review it with counsel," she said. "Of course," he said. "One more thing," she said. "Yes," he said. "The logistics hub at Kellner. The one that replaced Block C, is it operational?" she said. "It opened last month," he said. "I heard the distribution tenant pulled out." She paused. Then she said, 2 months after signing, they found a better location," he said. "I know. One of my clients owns the building they moved to." Eleanor Price looked at the table, not suppressing a smile, choosing not to express it. Seth said, "I'll have my answer by Friday." He called Conrad from the parking lot. He said, "You might want to come in early tomorrow," he said. "There's something I want to walk through with you," Conrad said. "The Vantex thing," Seth said. "How did you know about the Vantex thing?" Conrad said. "I've been watching that stock for 6 months," he said. "I figured they'd come eventually." Seth drove. He thought about the document on the table, about Dominic Hale's email, about 14 years in Unit 14, and the letter that arrived on a Monday, and the 9-day move, and the first jig coming off the floor, and the column in the notebook that was filling up with specific things. He picked up Lily at 3:15. She came out of the building with Button under her arm and her backpack bouncing, and the expression of a person who has had a full day and is prepared to report on it thoroughly. In the truck, she told him about the thing that happened at lunch with the juice box, and about the drawing she had made of Button in art class, which, the teacher had said, showed good observation, and about the book they were reading in circle time, which had a rabbit in it, and which Lily had noted was not as good as Button, but was a reasonable, fictional representation. Seth drove and listened, and said the right things at the right times. Then she said, "Did something happen today, Dad?" He said, "Something important." She said, "Good important or still thinking important?" He said, "I think good. I'm still making sure." She held Button in the way she held him, when she was considering something seriously. Pressed flat against her chest, both arms around him, chin resting lightly on top of his head. She said, "When I'm still making sure about something, I talk to Button." He said, "What does Button say?" She said, "He says that if it feels right inside, it probably is." Seth looked at the road. He looked at the afternoon light on the fields outside the county line. He thought about the 41,000 square feet of floor space, where 8 people, 9 now, they'd hired a machinist in month 3, came every day and made things that were better than what had existed before. He thought about the first call he had made in the second week, to the property 40 minutes east, about signing the lease in a parking lot on a phone. He thought about what it feels like inside. When you have done something right, he said, "Button's pretty smart." Lily said, "He's very smart." She said it with the certainty of someone who has trusted a thing for a long time and found the Trust consistently returned. They turned onto their street. The afternoon was doing what afternoons do in that season, cooling at the edges, holding on in the middle, the light lowering itself slowly and without complaint. Seth parked. He turned off the engine. He sat for one moment in the quiet of the truck. Then he got out and went inside to make dinner. And Lily came behind him, with Button pressed against her chest and the sound of her feet on the porch steps and the door opening into the warm inside of the house. And the day settled into the kind of quiet that follows a day when the right thing has been confirmed. He had a week to give his answer. He knew his answer already. He went to the stove. He made dinner.